who does the serpent represent in Genesis 3? And I find this an interesting topic because you think of the fall, Adam and Eve taking the fruit of knowledge, and then the subsequent cursing is a really poignant moment. It really shapes basically the entire history of kind of creation from that point on. And so you would think it would be mentioned a lot in the rest of the Bible. The Bible loves referencing earlier parts of the Bible and other parts of the Bible. And so you think this story would come up, and you think the serpent would come up a lot, and it doesn't really. It doesn't really appear much in the Old Testament. And then there are 3 times it's mentioned in the New Testament. We have 2 Corinthians 11 verse 3, where Paul specifically references Eve and the serpent in the garden. And then we have Revelation 12 verse 9 and 20 verse 2, both which mention the ancient serpent. And so clearly here the author John is making a reference back to the serpent of the garden without specifically mentioning that story. But outside of that, this story isn't mentioned a huge amount, which is interesting. And so we're left with the question, who is the serpent in Genesis 3? And there are a number of different interpretations. I've heard some people just say, well, it's just a serpent. It's just a snake. There's not much more to that. It's just one of an animal that happened to come up and try and convince Eve to take the fruit. And I've heard some Christians even say that this is why snakes don't have legs, that before they did have legs, because God cursed them and said you should crawl on your belly, God took their legs away, and so now they are crawling on their belly. I think this is an overly literal and unnecessary way of reading the passage. I don't think it's helpful. Particularly when you look at ancient Near Eastern cultures of the time, whenever you've got a talking animal, it almost always means that there's some sort of spiritual being involved. Maybe the spiritual being is pretending to be an animal, or the spiritual being is kind of talking through an actual animal. Either way, there is a spiritual being involved. And so I think when we look at Genesis 3, we're meant to see some form of spiritual being, some form of spiritual force at play here. So then the next obvious answer that most people would go for would be that this is Satan. This is the devil. This is the ultimate big bad guy behind everything. And in light of the whole Bible, I have no problems with this interpretation. Clearly, when you look at Revelation 12 and 20, John is making that association. He is drawing on the image of the serpent of Genesis 3 and pulling it into the understanding of Satan, the big bad guy. Some pushback that I'd have with this is whenever you read a Bible passage, there's multiple levels that you read it on. So there's how do I apply this to my life today? But before you get to that point, you need to really go, well, what did this mean, in the context of the whole Bible? How do I understand this through the lens of reading the whole Bible? And then before that, you need to understand what did it mean at the time it was first written. So Genesis was obviously written before the New Testament, and so the readers of Genesis didn't have the New Testament understanding. And so what did it mean to the writers at that point? And when we look at it at that lens, we don't really see much reference to a big bad guy, a devil, a Satan in the Old Testament in the way that we understand it in the New Testament. So we've got a few images that get drawn on. So for example, in Isaiah 14 verse 12, we get mention of a fallen morning star. And the idea being that stars were used as ways of describing spiritual beings, that a morning star was a star that was so bright it shone during the day. And so this was a significantly powerful, important spiritual being falling from heaven. And then in Job, we have mention of the Satan. But even there, it's the Satan. It's a title rather than a name. And so in Job, we're not meant to see the ultimate big bad guy. In Job, we're seeing someone who is fulfilling the role of a Satan. And the context of this passage is God is holding council with all of his spiritual beings. All of his council members are coming and giving a report. And so this Satan is one of these things. And he basically, unfortunately, the only kind of term we have for it today would be a devil's advocate, which obviously brings unhelpful associations here. But his role in the council was basically just to push back and question, is that right? Are we sure? Is that definitely the case? And we know this because he doesn't have to sneak in or break into the council. He's welcome. He's one of the council members. And God's the one that asks him, hey, have you seen my servant Job? And so God's the one that's initiating and engaging with this, and the Satan is mainly just asking the question, are we sure? Is this definitely the case? Is Job actually good, or is he just good because you're good to him? And so what I'm saying here is in the Old Testament, we've got a load of separate different images being used, and the New Testament is the one that draws all of these images together to create the idea of an ultimate big bad guy, the devil. So bringing it back to Genesis 3, how are we meant to understand Genesis 3 in its original context before we look at it in light of the New Testament? And I think we're meant to see the serpent here as just a being of chaos, an agent of chaos. The serpents in general, snakes in general, were seen as chaotic beings because they came from the realm of chaos, which is just the wilderness. You find them in wilderness places. The Bible Project have done an incredible podcast series recently on the chaos dragon, looking at serpents and other beasts and how they embodied chaos. And so I think in Genesis 3, we're just meant to see this as a spiritual being in some sense that's just an agent of chaos, trying to stick their oar in and cause problems. And then as we then step back and look at it in a much wider context, we can start to pull it into our imagery and our understanding of the ultimate big bad guy, Satan. I hope you found that helpful. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments below. This was a snippet of a much larger conversation, which you can find here, or you can get plugged in with our Bible in a Year commentary just there. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next video.